and welcome to the Life and Liberty podcast. I'm Sharayah Colter with the Danbury Institute. Happy to serve as the Chief Communications Officer here for the Danbury Institute. And this morning, today, we are thrilled to have with us Bradley Pierce, who serves as the president of the Foundation to Abolish Abortion. And we're going just to have a really great conversation today about the sanctity of life and how we go about defending that. So thank you so much, Bradley, for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Sharayah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, if you just would kick us off a little bit by introducing yourself to our listeners, I think people would be glad to know just who you are and where you come from and how you came to find yourself even, in this line of work, in this conversation, in this whole space.
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. I'm a Christian. That's the most important thing about me, by the grace of God. Raised in a Christian home. I'm very grateful for Christian heritage. And my wife and I, we have 12 children of our own that we're raising, or we're expecting number 12. Number 12 is on the way right now.
Congratulations.
So we're very, very blessed. I was a homeschool graduate. So was my wife. We homeschool our children. And I've just gotten, I've always been, I was raised pro-life, raised voting, you need to vote pro-life and believing that life begins at conception, created in the image of God and all of that. But it wasn't until about 9 years ago now that I really, or maybe about 12 years ago, that I kind of woke up to some problems that I saw in pro-life strategy from a legislative and legal perspective, and really got involved about 9 years ago now, and have been working in that area. In addition to my other practice, I help defend parental rights through Heritage Defense, another organization that I work with. And but really spent the last 9 years also focusing on this issue too.
And I think you're pretty humble about all of that you've just said. But from what I have read and know about you, you are a constitutional attorney. Is that right?
Yes, that's
Okay.
a big part of it. Sorry if I didn't mention that.
No, and I
Yeah,
think
I'm
that
also
you
an
have
attorney.
even submitted a brief in the Dobbs case. Is that right?
We did. We submitted a brief in that case that I wrote for that and signed on to by 20 state legislators and 20 other organizations. And so we were calling for the court to overturn Roe, which it did. We're grateful for. But we were also calling on the court to go even further and find that, as they would say, a fetus is a person under the 14th Amendment and therefore entitled to equal protection. And at least for now, the court chose not to do that and kind of just wash their hands of the issue and at least act like the Constitution is neutral on the issue, which we don't believe that it is. And we don't think that Christians should be neutral. And so there's still a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. Yes, definitely a lot of work to do. Hopefully we can see some progress on that front too with, obviously we all know that is the case, that a fetus is a human being. It's a living person who should be afforded all the same rights as people outside the womb. So we will continue to pray for that to be recognized in our laws. So can you kind of help us, for our listeners, paint the picture for us of the landscape of kind of where we are? A lot of people listening probably right now, they would describe themselves as people who defend the sanctity of life, like yourself, a lot of Christians who we want to protect life, we value life, we believe that God is the author of life and that it's valuable from the moment of conception, fertilization. So can you kind of just help people kind of understand where we are now? We were under Roe and Casey. Now with the Dobbs decision, we are thankfully on the right side of that, in a much better spot. But where are we now as far as like the fight legally for defending the sanctity of life?
Yeah. So, I'm an abolitionist, and we've on this issue on Roe versus Wade, we believed that Roe was null and void from the beginning, and we should have been ignoring it. So, thankfully that's out of the way, though, so we don't really have to fight over that issue anymore. Even the Supreme Court agrees with us, right? The Roe was unconstitutional. So now we're in an issue where, okay, the Supreme Court has basically said states, or as they put it, the people's representatives, right?
Yes.
Kind of, this is in your hands, kind of do whatever you want, sort of, in non-legalese terms. And so that's where we are now. So what we're finding out is that there were a lot of politicians who had said, like, well, I would abolish abortion, but that Roe versus Wade won't let me. And now we're finding out that actually they're not all that interested in doing it. They're not for various reasons. And so lots of states that could abolish abortion have not. We're seeing abortion numbers across the country have actually risen since Roe was overturned. There's more abortions, more children being murdered by abortion now than there was before Dobbs. Even in states that have so-called bans on abortion, those only apply to Planned Parenthood and abortion doctors and that sort of thing that prohibit them from doing abortions. And they explicitly say this does not apply to the woman. So it's still perfectly legal under those bills for women to order abortion pills, which is now cheaper and easier than it ever was, and to take those abortion pills and to murder their own children. And even if they do so willingly, knowingly, without anyone coercing them at all, that's still completely legal in all 50 states. And so there's not a single state in the country that has abolished abortion today.
I think that'll be, surprising information to a lot of people who have thought we were making, progress. And certainly we have made progress. The Dobbs decision is great. But to find out that more abortions are happening now, it's going to be, I think, a shock to some people. And I think, like you just said, the abortion pill is a huge part of that. We just had an event in Dallas where we had a panel talking about the abortion pill, and another one talking about, abolition and incrementalism and these topics. And we kind of got into the part about, when a woman takes the abortion pill, now you are eliminating the outside physician or abortionist as a role, and now the woman is becoming the abortionist. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for, making progress on this front? Because for a long time, people have said, like, oh, let's just get the abortionist, just get the abortionist. But what happens now when there is no one else to prosecute but the woman who is willingly, knowingly, killing the child in her womb?
Right. There certainly are some women who are victims, right? That someone's forcing them into something, or there's some that really don't know what they're doing. Under the law, we'd call that mistake of fact, right? They don't really know what they're doing. But the way a lot of the pro-life movement has talked about women has been as if all women are in one of those two categories, right? They either have a gun to their head or they're just completely ignorant about how things work, and that's not most women, right? Women are strong, women are smart, and most of them know exactly what they're doing and exactly the risks involved with taking the pill, and and they're choosing to take the life of their own child because they don't want to be pregnant for a host of reasons. And so what equal protection really means, it's in the Constitution. We believe it's also biblical. God says you shall not show partiality in judgment, meaning, you don't have different laws for people, just different laws for women versus men and things like that, or whether you're born or whether you're not yet born. So, we believe that equal protection, or as God would call it, non-partiality, that's constitutional, that's biblical, and it doesn't mean that every woman should be prosecuted, right? It just means that every case should be considered on a case by case basis, right? That's what we do right now with homicides of born people. That's the way our laws currently work, right? The law applies to everybody. Everybody's equally subject to the law. But then as far as how each situation is handled, that's on a case by case basis. We have law enforcement, prosecutors, grand juries, judges, juries, appellate courts, Supreme Courts, governors, boards of pardons and paroles, this entire justice system to kind of decide what is just in each situation. And all equal protection means is that same justice system that protects our lives should also protect the lives of people before they're born.
Right. As Christians, I think a huge part of what we try to appeal to is consistency. Like you're talking about, God is not a God of partiality. And we see in scripture lots of times where he's talking about unequal weights and measures are not of God. And so we look for ways to apply our laws, we should, consistently. And, it strikes me there's a piece of legislation that was signed into law in 2004 by President George Bush. And I wrote about this recently, and this really struck me that there is literally a section in this piece of legislation. The legislation was Unborn Victims of Violence Act. And so the whole goal is to say that people in the womb um, are protected, and you can't just kill them. But there's a whole section that says nothing in this section, this is quoting from the legislation, nothing in this section shall be construed to permit the prosecution, one, of any person for conduct relating to an abortion for which the consent of the pregnant woman or a person authorized by law to act on her behalf has been obtained. And it goes on and says some more things along those lines. But how it seems really crazy, to put it bluntly, that we would have laws in our country that say a life in the womb is valuable and that a normal person cannot kill it without repercussion, but then that there's a literal carve out that says, but unless you are the mother or unless you are authorized by the mother, then it's fine. That doesn't seem to be biblically consistent, morally consistent. It shouldn't be. It doesn't seem legally consistent.
Right, definitely not. And these kind of things, that we see even in all of the pro-life legislation, it reflects really our own, how much do we really believe what we say, right? When we
Mhm.
say, I believe life begins at conception, okay, well then, do you believe that the same laws that protect my life should protect people from conception? Oh, well, hold on, not so fast. Right. Oh, well, then you must not really believe that life begins at conception, at fertilization, because actions speak louder than words, and that's been the issue with a lot of the pro-life lobby, a lot of the pro-life establishment. Saying yes, life begins at conception, life begins at fertilization. It's like, okay, so yeah, so the same laws to protect the same homicide laws should protect those babies too, right? It's like, no, no. In fact, we're going to write into the pro-life bills that this does not apply to the woman. Well, wait, just women who are forced, right? No, no, no. All women, period. And so, like I was in a committee hearing on a equal protection bill in North Dakota earlier this year, and one of the legislators, there was this pro-life organization that got up in opposition to the bill and saying, we don't think any woman should be prosecuted ever and should be subject to this, at all. And they should have total immunity from the law, which is basically saying a woman should have a right to self-induced abortion. That's really the legal effect of saying that. And one of the legislators asked this pro-life leader and said, "What if the president of Planned Parenthood came here, walked up on our Capitol steps, took an abortion pill, and said, 'I am killing my baby, and I know what I'm doing'? Right? Shouldn't she be subject to prosecution?" And this pro-life leader said, "Well, that would be an action of from hurting. She's hurting, and that's why she's taking that action." And it's like, I mean, talk about taking compassion too far, right?
Right.
When it talk about kind of misplaced compassion, when you have someone who is the president of Planned Parenthood intentionally, knowingly, willfully murdering their own child, and we say, well, she shouldn't be prosecuted. We should have compassion on her. It's like, what about her child, right? What about her child who's now murdered? And really, the purpose of the law isn't that we just want retribution, although that is a purpose of the law, right? That there is justice for the victim, but the main purpose of criminal law, first, is to teach, but then secondly, the main purpose is to deter. So wouldn't we? Don't we want laws deterring women from thinking it's okay to murder their children? I think so.
Which not only is protecting that unborn life, but it's protecting that woman from making a decision that is certainly going to stay with her for the rest of her life and haunt
Absolutely.
her.
Well, and it's not it's protecting the baby first, and then it
Mhm.
is protecting the woman from having that guilt on her. But then thirdly, it's also protecting the woman, because what a lot of people don't realize is that when you say that women have total immunity, right, meaning that it's legally okay for them to commit a self-induced abortion, now you're also saying that it is legal for men, or her parents or whoever, to pressure her into that abortion, right? As long as it's illegal to force her, of course, right? It's illegal to threaten her with violence, right? That's illegal in every state. But it's not illegal to pressure her to say, I'm going to break up with you, I'm going to cut you off financially, I'm going to do these things that are not violence or threatening violence to you, but
Mhm.
I'm going to pressure you into it. And right now, that's completely legal for women to be coerced into abortions in that way, for people to coerce women into abortions. That's totally legal. But if you make it murder for everyone, now that man or pimp or her parents or whoever that's now coercing her, now they're soliciting murder. That's a crime. Now they're conspiracy to murder. That's a crime. Now they are a party to the murder. That they are criminals, and so that's going to not only protect that baby, but also protect women from coercion as well.
Right. And I think, like you're saying, they're inadvertently making her more vulnerable to those, that attack and that coercion, that pressure from people. And, along the lines of consistency, I've read many stories, but one very recently, and these are heartbreaking, but of a woman who, had a baby, and like 30 minutes or within minutes, an hour, she throws the baby in the trash and the baby dies.
Right.
And then you see moral outrage. There's really no debate at that point. Like, you don't hear anyone defending her actions and saying like, "Oh, well, she was distraught, or she was young, or it was going to get in the way of college, or she didn't want the baby, or the father of the baby did this or that." None of that. Everyone, I have not seen any exception to this. Everyone pretty much says like, "Wow, what a horrible human being for throwing a baby in the trash and allowing it to die." Yet, an hour and a half prior, you would have had, 55, 60% of the country say like, "Well, it's her choice." Um, that doesn't seem to jive, just from a
Right.
moral and perspective. That seems like a really big chasm there of some some discontinuity.
Well, and that's a very good point, and that's one reason why we can certainly lay a lot of fault at the feet of the abortion industry and pro-abortion and those who hate God, but unfortunately, there's a lot of fault also on the part of the pro-life you know lobby as well, because when you write bills that tell women that it's okay, right, that provide total immunity for them, then you're telling them by your actions that it's not really a baby, it's not really a life. And so we shouldn't be surprised when people act that way. And so, a lot of us say, like, well, people have been indoctrinated. Well, they have, by the pro abortion movement, but even by the pro life movement and the bills that the pro life movement writes. And that's why we've got to stop with that. We have to be consistent on this. We can't be conceding when life begins or how we treat it. We need to be treating their lives as being equally valuable as ours.
Absolutely. So some of that is fleshed out, legislatively. We need to be writing laws that do completely outlaw abortion. One of the topics that came up on the panel that we had at our recent event, talking about abolition and incrementalism, is, so what do you do with laws that are proposed that are an incremental approach, like a heartbeat bill, that sort of thing? Um, some would say like, okay, well, we shouldn't be the ones initiating those bills, but if they are put forward, so what do you think about that? Do you think that someone should vote for them in order to not vote against it, or and save some, or should they just not vote for, they should vote against that? How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that That's a number of things on that. First of all, God is clear what we should be demanding. We should be demanding the total abolition of abortion, justice without partiality, or as the Constitution says, equal protection. That's what we should be demanding. That's the bills we should be writing. We shouldn't be writing anything else other than that. That should be what we're pushing for. Um, then let's say that there are others, let's say outside of the church, right, outside of Christianity, who propose these sorts of things. Well, then we have to examine them in the light of God's words. Like, can we support this? And
Mhm.
God says repeatedly in Scripture, "You shall not show partiality in judgment." Right. So if there's any bill that says, "Well, if you're this age, you're protected, but if you're this age, you're not," or if you're born this, if you're not born, you get it, that's partiality. Or if the bill says, "Well, this applies to men but not women," right? That's partiality. And we have to oppose those things. We have to oppose things because God says He opposes it. Even if we think it's the best strategy, right? There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And so we have to say, what does God think about these bills? and God forbids showing partiality and judgment. So even though we may think that it's a great strategy, God forbids it. Kind of like if we may think, if the Israelites thought, what would be a great strategy to help us win wars would be getting a whole lot of chariots and a whole lot of horses from Egypt. It's like God explicitly said, you shall not do that. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is the same sort of thing here. God explicitly says, you shall not show partiality in judgment. And so that's what almost all of these bills are. And so we absolutely need to be not supporting them. And one problem, and kind of that's the principle, but the practical side of it is that when you pass these bills, your people think that there's some big victory that's been achieved and somehow that we've banned abortion. And that's what a lot of the pro-life establishment is like, hey, wait, we passed this total abortion ban. Or as a lot of people said for a while, uh, Texas and Oklahoma, and there's 13 14 states that are abortion free was the terminology
Mm-hmm.
that was being used for a while. I'm not seeing that as much, probably because we produced a docuseries called Abortion Free, and just kind of pointing this out that hey, there's more abortions now than ever. Even in those states, numbers aren't going down. Um, Anyways, we're not seeing that as much. But you pass these things like here in Texas, you go talk to average Texan, pro life Texan. For a while there, most of them would say, "Oh, well, there's no more abortions in Texas," when in
Mm-hmm.
fact, virtually the same number of Texas babies were being aborted, either through abortion travel, but more and more, over 25,000 now, right here on Texas soil, by self-induced abortion. And so by passing these kind of increments, that still show partiality, that don't actually even lower the numbers, but they give this false sense of victory. We're actually taking people out of the fight. We're telling them go to sleep, go home, focus on other issues. Whenever this issue has not gone away, and so that's a big practical problem with supporting bills like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, we do know we live, in a democratic republic, and we are counting on people that go to the polls and vote their values, vote their biblical values. So we're in a kind of conundrum at the moment, since we are clearly seeing, unfortunately, that our country is. This breaks my heart, but it's not a pro-life country. We have a lot of work to do. It's by and large pro-choice. So a lot of the work we have to do is education and helping people to have a heart change and see that pro-choice is not consistent with God and the Bible. And so what do we do? What are some practical ways that we can go about, you know, affecting positively the culture, so that, and maybe in a few election cycles we can say, hey, we have radically changed the electorate into people understand this issue better. They understand it's a baby, that it's a human life, that it's valuable, and they're willing to vote pro-life because they've literally had a heart change. What do we do as the church? We have a lot of pastors that are a part of our network, and so they're looking for ways to really, train up and disciple their people well. But it's a really big task. So, what do you think
Right.
is the best way to go about that?
Well, I think of it like this. I think there are some things we can do, and I'll get to those. But ultimately, we need God to do something. We need we're not big enough to defeat this giant. We're not strong enough. We're not smart enough. We need Him to do this, and so He tells us what we should do. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will heal their land. We need Him to fight our enemies for us. We need Him to fight abortion for us. And so, what's most important that we do first, before we even think about like what are the own steps that we can take practically, the most important thing for us is to examine ourselves and our own heart and our own actions. Have I been inconsistent? Have I been apathetic? Have I been supporting things that God says He hates? The abomination, equal weights and measures, abomination to Him. Acquitting the guilty and punishing the righteous, that's an abomination. Have I been supporting things that do that? Then God forgive me for that. Right? God's people need to be doing that, and pastors need to be leading churches to do that. And then I really believe, I think we should have simple childlike faith that if we do God's will, God's ways, then He will bless it and He will show up and He will fight our battles for us. And that's what we need more than anything else. As far as what we can do beyond that, I mean, that's all we need to do, right? But yes, pastors should be preaching on this. And when
Mhm.
bills of abolition are filed that provide equal protection, um, then Christians need to be coming out and supporting those and talking about those and stop fearing man. Um, yes, it's going to make people mad. Yes, it's going to make us lose some friends and maybe lose some political capital on some fronts. But you know what? God will be pleased with it and He will use it and He will do a work. And it will be a witness, a faithful witness to this society of Christians really treating babies like they're human beings from fertilization. And I think that's what we should do.
Yeah. So I hear you saying first we work and pray for revival, starting with our own selves, and then we do look for just ways that we can please the Lord, however that
Right.
fleshes itself out.
And there's lots of, we should be,
Mm.
again, that's kind of abolishing abortion, but then there's like abortions, right? Reaching
Mhm.
individual women and
Yeah.
men and talking to them about life and about parenthood and about, like encouraging the church coming alongside of them and pregnancy help centers and like all of that we should be doing on a lot of fronts, right? There's a whole lot that we should be doing, but it's got to start with a heart change for all of us. And I think we all have room, to examine ourselves on this issue.
Yeah. So to wrap up, as you look out, into the future, do you look out with, do you have a positive outlook and you're hopeful, or does it look, bleak? What do you see?
I don't know. I'm not God. I don't know exactly what the future is going to look like, but I am extremely hopeful about it because I know
Mhm.
God is on His throne. We do live in a constitutional republic, but it's under a monarch, Jesus Christ, who's the King of Kings. And so I'm not really worried about the future. I know that it's in His hands, and I know that if we, His people, are being faithful to Him, then He says He will preserve a remnant of His people. He says that He will fight for His people, and so I know that He will do that. So that's where my confidence is. So I'm definitely hopeful about that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Bradley, so much for this really helpful conversation today. Thank you for taking the time to join us and to just, impart some of your wisdom and your experience here with us. Thank you very much for your time.
It's been great. Thanks again for having me.
Absolutely.
This has been an edition of the Life and Liberty podcast of the Danbury Institute. The Danbury Institute is an association of churches, Christians, and organizations aligned to affirm and preserve God-given rights to life and liberty. To learn more, visit danburyinstitute.org. The work of the Danbury Institute relies on generous patriots like you. To support, visit danburyinstitute.org/give.